Hello! This is Hooked by Happenstance. I'm Kendra, and it is time for chapter 40 of Yarn Tales. Yarn Tales is my ongoing series where I read books, I tell you about them, and then I apply silly Kendra rules to my rating for the book, and I add a segment to my shawl. Now, I had originally intended to make one shawl, which became two. We're currently on shawl number 3, and this is the second to last book in the shawl. Which means that in addition to adding some beads, because we're in the middle of a readathon, I am also starting to finagle with yarn and not even play chicken. Like, we're beyond playing yarn chicken. I am now designing around the yarn I have available. So that will all come up shortly. But the book we are going to discuss today is called Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lin. The Mountain Meets the Moon is a book that we were originally going to read for Buzzwordathon because it has the word where in it, but we ran out of time because I experienced this book as an audiobook with my kids. We listened to it through Libby, which is the Overdrive app, and we listened to it on our TV, so we had the nice big speakers for everybody to hear. But we didn't get to it for Buzzwordathon, and we decided when Fantasyathon came up that since this counted as a fantasy book, we would just roll right in with the next readathon and do it then. So we listened to this book over the course of several evenings while the kids did various crafty and creative endeavors, and I crocheted, and we just absorbed this wonderful, wonderful book. Where the Mountain Meets the Moon is a fantasy book that incorporates Chinese folklore. So it's kind of neat because it has like an overarching plot about a girl who comes from a poor family and like they're kind of struggling to make ends meet, even have food to eat, and her progression with her family and their dealing with their poverty and her dealing with her parents because of it. And she kind of goes on this hero's journey across the whole book. And while she's meeting all of these characters along the way in her journey, they all impart Chinese folklore to her. Like when someone will try to explain what's going on to her, instead of just saying this is what's happening, they'll tell her a folk tale. And so you get a whole bunch of Chinese folklore in this one overarching story, which was really a good way, I think, to kind of be an introduction for my kids and myself to a lot of the Chinese folklore. I'm not sure if the folklore is all like actually based in any sort of historical fact, or if these are just kind of based on some general principles. I think that they're definitely based on principles of Chinese folklore because some of the stories sounded vaguely familiar or like threads of other stories I've heard in the past, but they weren't necessarily direct retellings. So I'm not sure on that. This book did win a Newbery Award medal, and I can totally see why. It was lovely and clear. The narration was nice, but the story itself was just, it did a good job of world building and character building while also being simple enough that you could kind of follow what was happening, even though there was a lot of movement of characters and locations, which can be a little confusing and a kind of fantasy-esque children's story. Sometimes if there's too many places they go, it's hard to keep track of where you're at. But this book did not have that problem. There are also 2 other books which they call companion books to this. They're not continuations necessarily. We have not read them yet, but I intend to at some point. They're like on my radar. It sounds to me, I don't know if the characters are going to be like descendants of the characters in this book, or if it's just a similar story structure, but they are listed everywhere as being companion books, not just more books by the same author. In fact, Grace Lin has written some other books in general, which I'm interested in, that are written in like a different kind of format. So she is definitely an author that is now on my radar and that I want to consume more stuff from because I liked her voice. Like author's voice, not necessarily the narrators. But the narrators were good in this book too. But they were not the thing that like drew me in. It was the writing style. So overall, I gave this book 4 stars. It was super enjoyable. The story structure was nice. The only reason it didn't get 5 is there was no like super wow factor to me. There was nothing that just like threw me over the edge. Makes you want to recommend this to everybody. But I definitely think if you're interested in reading more Chinese folklore, more Asian-based literature, that is a good way to do it. And reading a story about a child growing up in Asia in the way this book presents it was really interesting. So now let's move on to my shawl, which did, as I said, require a bit of finagling. So I'm down to my last 2 books. in this shawl. And the way that I had been working it is I had bought 4 yarns for my shawl. A yarn for books I experienced with my kids, a yarn for my Life's Library subscription books, a yarn for audiobooks I experienced by myself, and a yarn for physical books I experienced by myself. Well, I have experienced many audiobooks by myself, many physical books by myself, and many books with my children. What I did not read any of in the month of April, or at least the portion of April that we're talking about for this shawl, were any of my Life's Library books. So I had a whole skein of Lolo Did It in the color Bourbon left. I also, since I had bought 2 skeins of the waist color from Cattails, I had some of that left as well. What I did not have enough of was the Green Man from Cattails, which is what I had been planning to use as the yarn for books that I read with my kids, audiobook or physical. So I just made it work, and what I decided to do was, since this was an audiobook that we experienced, I went ahead and used the audiobook color, but I put 1 stripe of the star progression in the color that I had picked for the kids. I know, it sounds a little confusing, but it really isn't. So this is the color Green Man from Cattails, which I had been using for books I experienced with my kids. And this is the waist color, which is also from Cattails, which I had been using for audiobooks that I experienced by myself. So I just used the audiobook color, and then you can see here in my textured single crochet, my 4 rows that delineate the stars, I went ahead and one of the rows is made in the Green Man color to kind of signify that this probably should have been done in the green. I just didn't have the yarn to do it. I also went ahead and put a bunch of beads into the patterned row for the yarn because it was part of a readathon. And I also used the pattern row, each of my yarns, I've been doing a different patterned row for the kind of books. And I used the patterned row for books with my kids, even though I was using an audiobook colored yarn. I know that's probably very confusing, but it makes sense to me, and it made me feel like I was still following the rules I had set up, using the yarn that I had on hand, and getting the shawl to a good finished size, and also finishing out my readathon worth of books in the shawl before I call shawl number 3 finished. So here we have it. I've read many good books, obviously. There's some very thick stripes. There's a couple thin stripes coming through the shawl, but I'm very happy with how it's turning out. I'm really looking forward to getting this last stripe on here for the next chapter, and then we'll get to weave ends and block, and this one fits really neat. I've been changing up with each of the shawls that I'm making. I'm using the same general concept of how I'm doing the stitch patterns and adding chapters based on kind of books. However, I've been using some different, I've been using 2 different sizes of yarn. 2 of the shawls so far are DK weight and 1 has been fingering, so that changes up the stitch counts. I've also been playing around with stitch counts, increases, and shaping to kind of find like what I can do with the same basic pattern, and like playing around with it just so that when I do make a pattern in the end and just in the future, I just have a lot of information to work with. And the only way to get that information is to try things. So that's what I'm doing. But I am really excited with the way this particular shawl is working up and fitting. So once it's all done, ends woven, and blocked, then we'll look at the shape, and I think that you'll enjoy it as well. But like I say, there's one more chapter to this shawl coming. If you want to make sure that you don't miss out, go ahead and subscribe, because I don't post on a regulated schedule. These things will just pop up into your feed if you are subscribed. Also, there is a playlist here on the channel of all the Yarn Tales videos. If you've missed out on anything and want to catch up, they're all over there. So I will see you all next time. Bye!